What is going on, guys? My name is Anson and welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're going to be starting a brand new React.js tutorial. I've been wanting to do this for a while. The last time I made a tutorial on React was roughly about a year ago, I think. So I think it's time for a brand new one. Since then, I've actually learned a lot more about React and have improved a lot. So I feel like it'd be a good way to kind of like start from scratch, teach you guys all of the basics, and then get into more advanced features such as using hooks. Well, we're going to go from the basic hooks into the more advanced hooks. We're going to get into testing as well with React Testing Library. So I'm very excited for this tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started with a brief introduction on React.js. So what exactly is React.js? Well, React.js is a library that allows front-end developers to build powerful, rich, and modern progressive web applications. So think of web applications nowadays. A lot of web applications use React to be built with. So, and you'll see over the course, you'll understand why you would want to use React, because there's a lot of awesome features that make it very, very easy for you to build out your web application. And React pretty much simplifies the process of building and rendering content to the end user. So your users that will end up interacting with your user interface when they type stuff, whenever they scroll through your page, there's a lot of things that might happen that the user will react to. They will, for example, type stuff, they can click on buttons, and React provides a lot of high-level functions for the developer to work with to make complicated front-end logic much more simpler to deal with. So one of the cool features with React is that it allows you to build components that can be reused over and over and over again. So let's say, for example, if you were to build a regular front-end app using just vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you might find yourself reusing the same things over and over and over again. Or you might end up creating a function that allows you to build out some kind of template. So that way you can insert that into the DOM. So that template might return some kind of div element. It might return a paragraph tag. Maybe it's just some text. It might return, it can return a lot of things. Okay. And whenever you pass in data into that function that returns that template, it will pretty much have it all rendered out for you so that you can insert it into the DOM. Well, without having to worry about that, React pretty much provides these high-level functions that you can use to build out your components. And even much more easier, we can actually use JSX to describe how our component should look like. And it's actually very, very simple. And as we go through the tutorial, you'll see how everything will work. And you can also reuse your code. You can reuse your components over and over and over again to do literally whatever you want. You can also dynamically render certain things if you want to conditionally render, let's say some kind of navigation bar based on the width or height of the DOM. You can do that if you want to do it programmatically instead of using CSS. You can handle things like events, click events, on change events. You can do all that in React. Okay, pretty much anything that you can do with vanilla JavaScript, there's a way that you can do it much simpler in React. Okay? And the nice thing about React is that you will pretty much end up using your skills from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or TypeScript if you have learned TypeScript already. You can use those skills to use React. Now, I know I say HTML, CSS, they call it JSX, but like I said, it's relatively the same, and you'll see an example of that. Okay? And a couple fun facts: React was developed by Facebook and is still maintained by Facebook as of right now. React allows you to build out your views in a declarative way, and the React DOM library takes care of rendering your view to a virtual DOM. So React is the library that allows you to actually write out your component, describe how your component should look like, and then the React DOM takes care of rendering everything to a virtual DOM. Okay? And we also, like I said earlier, we use JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML, to create readable and reusable components. So that's a lot of words that we just said. That's a lot of words to interpret. Let's actually go ahead and get into let's actually get into some code. But before we get into some code, I want to talk about why we should use React.js. So React has been around since 2013, and it was designed and built to allow development of web applications, single page applications, and even mobile applications. And it was designed to make it much easier, much faster, and much more modular, so that it was a lot easier for teams, individual developers, or large enterprise teams to actually maintain and build out their product to consumers. And you can use React actually to build out mobile applications using React Native. Okay, so if you learn React, you also have the opportunity to use React to build out a mobile application. So you don't have to. So let's say if you're trying to build out a full stack application, you're trying to build the front end, the back end, and you don't want to just serve your application to just web users or desktop users. You want to serve it to people who primarily use their smartphones. Let's say you want to build some kind of alternative to Uber or Lyft. Well, you can do that using React Native. And React is also very stable. It's been around, like I said, for it's been pretty much 8 years since it's been developed, and it has a very mature ecosystem. There's a lot of libraries that you can install, third-party libraries that you can install that will support your application and its needs. So you can use things like React Router for site navigation. You should really say React Router, not React Routing. You can use Redux or Zustent for state management. So if your application needs to scale with lots and lots of data that needs to be modified on the DOM, but you don't want to have the user refresh the entire page, you kind of like want to have everything stored on the client. You can have some kind of state management to store everything, and then whenever you need it, you can instead of calling the API, you can retrieve it from the store. Okay, and you don't have to worry about state management right now. That's really more for the advanced tutorials. So don't worry about state management. And there's also styled components, which I think is really amazing. But like I said, these are things that you won't have to worry about right now. Just focus. We're going to only focus on the library itself. We will not really worry about the third-party libraries in the scope of this tutorial. Okay. So the prerequisites for learning React.js. So you should already have a solid understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like I said, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it's relatively very similar to JSX is what they call it. It's very similar, so don't worry too much about that. You should have a basic understanding of Node.js and NPM. The reason why I say Node.js is because we will be using Node.js, the Node.js runtime environment, to actually create our React app, and then we will use it to run our React app in local development. And that also requires to understand the basics of NPM, how to actually use it to start our project and build our project, as well as test our project. And this next step is totally optional, or this next prerequisite. You should definitely have a text editor, like Visual Studio Code. Now you can obviously use whatever text editor you want. Some people like to use Sublime Text or Atom or IntelliJ. I like to use Visual Studio Code. It's very lightweight compared to something like IntelliJ, and it gets the job done. It's really customizable. There's lots of extensions, lots of plugins, lots of themes that you can download. So I'd highly recommend it. So you can go to these two websites to download Node. And like I said, if you want, you can download Visual Studio Code. When you download Node.js, it comes with NPM. Okay? So that's pretty much it for the introduction. So I want to give you guys a quick little preview of the table of contents. So the first couple of episodes, we're going to go over the very basic things. So these are going to be things that I think that are going to be necessary to get your foot in the door with React. And then everything after state, we're going to really be talking about the more advanced things. So we're going to be talking about things like hooks, like useState, useEffect. We're going to be talking about useContext, and we're gonna have a lot of things to discuss. So as we're progressing through this whole tutorial series, more and more new tutorials will be coming about. But we're gonna go through the introduction. So we're gonna create a React app using a tool called Create React App. We're gonna walk through the project files, and we're gonna create a simple component We're going to talk briefly about JSX and kind of give you guys a feel of how JSX works, and you'll see how similar it is to HTML and CSS. I'm going to show you guys how components work. We're going to talk about components, why they're important, how to create reusable components, how to nest components. You're going to see that components and JSX are going to obviously work together. And like I said, if you have worked with HTML before, which I'm assuming that you guys have, a lot of things that you do in HTML are going to be very similar to what you do in components. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys how to pass in properties to components so that, let's say if you want to pass in certain data to a component so that it can be rendered or something can happen with it, you can do that. I'm going to show you guys how to do dynamic rendering. So let's say let's say you have 5 users that you want to display in the on a web page. I'm going to show you guys, instead of having to manually hard code every single thing, you can actually use cool tricks to render all of them dynamically, so you don't have to hard code it. And I'm going to show you how to conditionally render data too. So for example, let's say you want to render good morning only when it's between a certain time periods, like 4 a.m. to 12 p.m. And let's say for example you only want to show a profile picture if the user actually has one, and if the user doesn't have a profile picture, we'll show nothing. Okay, and then we'll talk about state, which is going to be pretty much it's pretty much going to be all of the variables that are defined for a component that describes the component itself, and everything that pretty much describes the scope of the component. So things like properties of a component, such as like a username, email address, etc., etc. And we'll also talk about the differences between component props and component state. So that's something that is very important to cover. So overall, my goal of this whole tutorial is to give you guys a better understanding of React. But I also want to go, sorry about that. Sorry about moving my screen. I also want to go more in depth on React so that you guys can actually understand React, and not only just using React. So whenever an employer or a recruiter or an interviewer asks you questions about React, you'll actually feel more confident and you'll be able to know the answer to it. So without further ado, that's going to be it for this little brief introduction, this little, discussion of React. Let's actually go ahead and get into creating a simple React app and get started with our tutorial. All right, guys, so we are back with part 1 with our getting started with React. We're going to go ahead and open up our Windows PowerShell. So I am on Windows. If you're on Mac, you can use your terminal, your Mac terminal. If you're on Linux, you can use the Linux terminal. If you're on Windows, you can use either the command prompt, you can use Windows PowerShell, you can use Windows Terminal. You can use whatever you want. But like I said, I'm assuming that you guys already have Node.js installed and you already have a text editor of your choice installed. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with creating the React app. So we're going to go ahead and use the npx script. So this is going to allow us to invoke the create React app script. So we're going to do npx create React app, and then we're going to go ahead and give the name of our project. So let me zoom in a little bit. I apologize for that. Let me zoom in, and we're going to go ahead and just say React.js tutorial video code. Okay, and I'm going to hit enter. So it's going to pretty much go through a series of instructions. It's going to install all of our dependencies. It's going to generate all of the files that we need to actually get our application working. So this will usually take a couple seconds, or again, it depends on your computer. For me, it usually takes roughly less than 30 seconds, I'd say. So it shouldn't take too long if you have a pretty fast computer. So let's just, here we go. So that didn't really take too much. Okay, and then it gives you some instructions, and it also initializes this with Git, seems like. So anyways, so I actually have a package manager called Yarn. So if you actually use Yarn, if you actually have Yarn installed, you can actually use Yarn. But you definitely should not use Yarn and npm together. It actually recommends you not to do that. For this tutorial, I'm going to use npm for everything, just so that we can be consistent. So let's just go ahead and get started. So we're going to go ahead and go into this React.js tutorial video code directory. So I'm going to type cd React.js tutorial video code, and I actually had 2 folders. So ignore the other one. That was a different repository that I had created. But this one is the one that we had created. So React.js tutorial video code. And you can also just hit tab to make it easier, but I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to type in code. And I'm going to do space dot. So this will open up Visual Studio Code with this repository. Now, you don't actually have to use that code command. You can actually just open up Visual Studio Code and manually open it using file and then open folder. But this is just a lot easier. So let's go ahead and go through the files real quick. We're not going to go through every single file, but I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. So at the very top, we have the node modules folder. So this is just all of the dependencies as well as sub-dependencies that was installed. So you can scroll through all of it. Like I said, you don't have to worry about anything inside here. So for example, we have React. We should have React installed in here. If you look right over here. Okay, we have React installed over here. And then all of these sub-dependencies of React and all of those sub-dependencies, they're all going to be installed inside this node modules folder. Okay, so like I said, you will rarely ever have to worry about this folder. So you can just ignore it. Next, we have the public folder. So this has the favorite icon. It has some static assets in here. The only thing that you'll have to worry about is this index.html. So if you want to do things such as change the title, you can do that over here. If you want to import fonts inside the head tag, you would do that in this index.html file. So this is where all the pretty much the public, the static stuff would go. And an important thing that to note about this index.html file is that it has this div with an ID of root inside this body tag. And this is actually important because this is actually the div element that is going to have our actual React application that is going to be mounted inside this div. So you can think of it like we're going to build our application and everything is going to be contained under one component. And that component is going to be injected into this div. It's going to be inserted into this div. And that is pretty much how our React application is going to work. Okay, so just wanted to let you guys know that. So like I said, you don't have to worry so much about this public folder. Let's go into our source folder. And we have a lot of files that look very similar based on the extension. Like we have the app.css file. This is just the CSS file that is for this app.js file over here. So this app.js file is a component. You can see that it has the function app as a function called app, and then this function has a return statement, and it returns what is called JSX. Okay, and we're not going to go through everything inside here right now. I just wanted to briefly show you guys that this is what a component would look like. Okay, but like I said, we'll go through JSX shortly. Okay, so and you can see that in this app.js file, it imports the logo from over here, which is a SVG file, and it imports the app.css file. So you can actually use this to style your components. So everything that's inside the CSS file, all of the classes, all of the IDs, all the media queries, everything. I'm pretty sure you can also, I think you might also, you can also use Sass with React too, which is also nice. But yeah, all of those styles are imported inside this app.js file. And they're also local too, which is nice. So you can also, so those will all reflect onto these div tags, the header, image, and etc. We also have a app.test.js file. So this is just for unit testing. So by default, React uses the React testing library, which is a very powerful testing library. We're not going to talk about that right now, but I think maybe we'll definitely talk about that in the more advanced tutorials. Okay, so you won't have to worry about this app.test.js file. We have the index.css file. So this is the CSS file that is imported by this index.js file. Or I'm sorry, this index.js file imports index.css file. Okay, and you can see that it's pretty much going to be the global styles. So because the index.js file is the entry point to our application, this is where we have all of the import React DOM statements in the index.js file. we have the index.css file imported. So everything that you are to define inside this index.css file, all of your styles, everything will reflect every single component if you were to attach the class names. So we also have our import app from app. So this is importing the function, right? So this is a default export, but it's importing the function from the app file. And it's, so you can think of it like a component is literally just a function, okay, that returns JSX. That's literally all it is, okay? And then we also have report web vitals, which like I said, you don't have to worry so much about that, so we're not gonna worry about that. So where all the magic happens is on line 7 to line 12. We have the React DOM. It calls this this function called render, and render takes in two parameters. It takes in the component that you want to render, and it takes in this document.get element by ID. Okay, so remember what I mentioned earlier. What's happening is that it's going to search for the this root element. You can actually rename this if you want. If you want to name this something else, just make sure you change this inside the index.html as well. Okay, and this argument over here is going to be the component we want to render. So this is actually wrapped between the strict mode tags. It's highly recommended that you keep it like this. You don't necessarily, your app would probably be a lot better if you wrapped it in strict mode. So we're gonna leave it like that. And then we have our app component that is being rendered right over here. And notice the syntax of it. It's very similar to HTML when we have the React.strict mode, and it wraps this app. You may have seen something very similar before. Like if you were to have a div tag, you would wrap something like an H1 tag, like that. So it's fairly similar, and this right over here is just a shorthand for doing the opening app tag and then the closing app tag. Okay, so you can just do it like that. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the index.js file. Remember, like I said, this is the entry point of our application. We also have the logo.svg file, nothing too important. We have the report web vitals, and then we also have the setup tests. This is for setting up your tests with it sets up just DOM. Like I said, don't worry so much about that. We'll leave the testing files alone. And then the other files, we have the getignore, we have a package.json file, we have a readme, and then last but not least, we have the yarn.lock file, which you don't have to worry so much about. So let's actually go ahead and run this React app, and let's see what we get out of the box. So let's go ahead and type npm start, or you can type npm run start, doesn't really matter, but npm start should work fine. And it's going to go ahead and start up our project. And underneath the hood, React uses something called Webpack to take care of everything, all the bundling, everything. And as you are making changes to your project, it will actually auto reload, so you don't have to worry about manually refreshing the page. And it also keeps track of, it also doesn't reset the state too. So for example, you can see that this is what we're given. If I want to delete the logo, that will be removed from DOM. If I want to remove this p tag and everything inside it, I can do that. If I want to remove this link, I can do that. Okay, and if I want to just remove the header too, I can do that as well. Okay, so yeah, this is just a very simple app. Like I said, nothing too special, just a very simple app. But let's go ahead and actually start from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete the app.js file. Actually, before I do that, let me actually open up the dev tools real quick and show you inside the elements. If you actually see right over here, this is the root. This is the div with the root ID, and you can see, let me actually zoom in, excuse me. So you can see that this this div with an ID of root is right over here. And you can see that inside this div, we have this, we pretty much have everything from our app component. Every single thing, right? All of this was exported and it was imported inside this index.js, and it was just rendered over here. That's all it was. If I wanted to, I can actually just do something like a div tag and do an h1 hello world, save that, And if I refresh, you can see that that literally just placed over there. Okay. And if I really wanted to, I can also just change the ID over here. And you can see that I'm going to get an error, and that's because the ID is different. So we got to change it to main. And now you can see that right over here, it's main. So like I said, you can leave it to whatever you want. It's up to you. Okay. So I just wanted you guys to understand that. And if you, like I said, if you want to change the title of the app, we can also do that. React.js tutorial app. And you can see the changes that appear. All right, so yeah, let's actually go ahead and let's delete the app.js file. Let's delete the app.css file. We don't need that. We will also delete the app.test.js file too. And we'll go ahead and get rid of all of the styling from our index.css. We'll leave the index.css alone because I will show you guys how to do some styling too. Just like the basics, nothing too crazy. And let's actually go ahead and delete this import. Okay, so we can leave the app running. Right now there's an error, but don't worry about it. We're gonna go ahead and fix that. So what we're gonna do, actually let me just make sure that we aren't, let me actually delete this logo, the SVG as well. Okay, everything should be fine. So what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna go ahead and create a component from scratch. So we're gonna go ahead, and what I like to do is I like to create a new folder called components, and this is where I would ideally put all of my components in here. So we're gonna create a component called let's just call it app.js, or you can call it root.js. Like I said, you can call it, you ideally want a main component that's going to hold all of your other components. So this is either going to be the app.js component that you decide to keep. You can call it a container, you can call it module. I'm just going to call it root.js. Now you can actually also use the JSX extension as well. Okay, so I'm going to use the JSX extension. Now there's really not much difference. You can use JS or JSX. The bundler will take care of resolving JSX or JS files if you're using JavaScript, obviously. If you're using TypeScript with React, it would take care of TypeScript files and TSX files. Okay, so TSX is pretty much the TypeScript version for JSX. But yeah, but usually based on convention, you should use JSX files for things that are related with JSX, and anything that does not have, anything JSX related should go in a JS file. Okay, so since we are going to be using JSX, let's keep it inside a JSX file. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called root. Okay, and like I said earlier, a component is literally just a function that returns JSX. That's pretty much it. So we can return something like a div, and you can also return, just a raw, like you can return like a div. You can return like inside this div, you can return an h1 tag. This is hello world. Very, very simple. Very, very simple stuff. So now let's actually just export this root. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and go into the index.jsx or index.js file, and we're going to import root from components root. Okay, now I'm actually since this is our root component, I'm going to put this inside this source file instead. Okay, and so we're going to fix that. That should be fixed. So that that file path should be fixed, and then we're going to go ahead and render root just like that. And then that should do the trick. Okay, and because this is a default export, we make sure we import it without curly braces. So this would only work if you had actual named exports. Okay. Anyway, so now we have our root component. Let's actually go ahead and let's actually create a couple other components, and let's play around with it and see what we can do with JSX. So right now we are returning JSX. Okay, we had this div. Okay, it's wrapped between these parentheses. So let's go ahead and create a simple component called, let's just call this a profile.jsx. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to I'm going to go ahead and use a arrow function. So we can do something like export const profile is equal to empty parentheses, and then arrow function, and then curly braces. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify a return statement, and I'm going to just return JSX. So I'm going to return a div, and this div is going to have some text. It's going to have, let's say, it's going to have a paragraph tag. We're going to say hello. Let's just say hello Anson, and we can have a description. You last logged in earlier today, something like that. Okay, just a simple example. We'll get into more complicated examples later. So this is another way that you can create a component. You can use an arrow function. Okay, now since our component doesn't really have any other variables, like we don't have any variables or any other logic or other functions in here that we need to call, we can actually, we don't actually need these curly braces. So I can actually get rid of that, and I can just do this instead. So this is just something nice with arrow functions. So you can make it a little bit more cleaner. And now if I want to import this component, all I gotta do is just import it up here. So import from components/profile. And now because this is a named export, right? We're not exporting this as a default export, we're exporting as a name. And we can pretty much import it like that up there in between curly braces. Okay. And usually when using name exports, they're really good if you have a lot of other exports in one file. You should use name exports if, let's say, if you want to create one file that wants to export all of the components or all the variables like from one file. So that's usually what a named export would be good for. Okay, so let's go ahead and render our component. So like I said, you can render your component using the shorthand syntax. If you wanted to use the closing tags, you can. Ideally, this is useful if you have any child nodes that you want to pass in, like in between. Let's say if you want to pass in some text or another component, you would basically use this syntax. Or there's also another way that you can do it, but we're not going to worry about that for now. Okay, but let's just use the shorthand syntax, and let's go ahead and refresh, and you can see that we have our component right over here, profile, that is being rendered. And now you can see that we have two components. We have one component that has another component inside of it, and you can keep on creating multiple components and nesting those components as much as you want. And that's one of the nice things about React. It makes it easy. Now let's actually go ahead and see what else we can do with JSX. So a couple things that I want to mention before we get into the more complicated things is when it comes to styling. Let's say if you want to style your components, let's say if I wanted to give this div a nice background, you could use inline styling if you wanted to. So for example, you can pass in the style, and you would basically pass in an equal sign. Okay, now in regular HTML, you would use quotes, and you would do something like width 500 pixels. That does not necessarily, and if you wanted to pass in the background color, you could do something like background color black. Okay, that does not work. Okay, if you wanted to use the style, let me zoom out a little bit. If you wanted to use the style attribute, okay, if you wanted to use the style attribute, you would, this is actually, it actually expects an object. Okay, so curly braces, and inside we have to specify an object. Okay, so inside this object, we're gonna go ahead and specify all the styles. So notice how if I type width, the IntelliSense is gonna pick that up, and we can give this a width of, let's just say 500 px, and then background color, we're gonna go ahead and give that a simple gray, or actually let's do 272727, which is a darker gray color. And let's go ahead and give it some color for the text. Let's do white. There we go. Looks pretty nice. And if we want to deal with global styling, we can do that inside the index.cs file, or it could be any CSS file that you import at the entry level of your app, You can import it inside index.css. If you imported it inside root.jsx, that should also work just fine too. But let's go ahead and just do that inside index.css since we already have that already. So let's go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just for fun, let me go ahead and find my favorite font that I like to use from Google. It's called Poppins, and I'm going to show you guys how to actually get fonts inside your app. So it's just going to be a very simple demonstration real quick. So let's go ahead and select this font, and you can either import this inside a CSS file. You can either import this in between the style tags, or you can just import this in between the head tag inside your index.html file. So what I like to do is I prefer to do it inside this public file, but you can do whichever way you want, and it'll work just fine. So you can do it right over here inside this public folder and the index.html file. We copied and pasted this right over here. Okay, and then now we're going to specify the font family. So I'm just close this out, and let's go inside index.css and let's just say body, the body element. Let's go ahead and say font family is going to be Poppins. Okay, and now we should see that all of our fonts should be reflected. These are all the global styles have been reflected. Okay, that's pretty cool. And we can also remove any additional margin. So let's just do HTML body, and then let's just do margin 0. And you can also remove the margin from the H1 tag that it gets by default. Okay, so I just thought I would cover that pretty quickly. Now let's say if you don't want to use inline styling, because personally I don't like using inline styling. What I would recommend is you can create a class for your styles. Okay, and so to do that in React, you wouldn't use the class attribute. It's actually called class name. So you would use the class name attribute, okay, and you would specify the class name. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a class. Let's call it profile wrapper. Okay, or we can call it profile root, whatever you want. And let's just give it all the styles that we want it to give it. So let's just give it a width of 500 pixels. Let's give it a color of white, and let's give it a background color of 272727. And we're going to go ahead and give the class name to this profile card. And there we go. We have our styles over here. And if I go ahead and give it some padding, let's do 20 pixels. And let's give it a box sizing of border box. Okay, you can see that that's how it works. I don't want to go super in depth on CSS because this is not a CSS course, but I just wanted to show you guys how you guys can use CSS classes in with JSX. When it comes to IDs work the same way. So if you want to do some IDs work the same way. Okay, that didn't change. Okay, so that's something worth noting. Now, if you want to deal with forms, let's create another component called forms or form. Sorry, let's call this a contact form .jsx, and let's go ahead and export const contact form is equal to this. And again, like I said, what we're doing is we're basically just declaring a variable called contact form. We're assigning a function that is going to return JSX, and we're just exporting it all in one go. If you really wanted to, you could just export it like this, but I prefer usually just doing it all in one go. Or like I said, you can export it as a default. So we're going to create a contact form, and let's go ahead and create a simple form. So like I said before, and I'm going to keep saying this, all a component is just a function that is going to return JSX. Okay, very, very simple. So we're going to return form, and like I said, all of the HTML elements should work. Okay, I'm pretty sure most, if not all, works. Okay, so we're gonna pretty much have a form in here, And for this contact form, we're going to actually have curly braces. The reason why is what we're going to do is we're gonna create some functions inside the scope of this function. Okay, so those functions are going to be in the closure of this component. Okay, and I'll show you exactly what I mean in just a second. So let's go ahead and create this form, and we're going to go ahead and create some inputs. So we're going to go ahead and create a div first, and inside this div I'm going to have a label. So just using the regular HTML label tag or HTML label element. And so usually with label you would have the for attribute. Instead it's actually HTML4, and you would specify the ID that this label belongs to. So we're going to go ahead and just say username. Let's just say input. Let's do form field username. Okay, and we'll just say username, and then we'll do inputs ID equals form field username, and that should definitely be very helpful. Okay, and let's just go ahead and render this contact form now. We'll render this inside the root component. So since I'm using Visual Studio Code, I'm just going to type in contact form, and IntelliSense should pick that up. I'm going to hit enter, and that should auto import it for me. Sometimes your IntelliSense might not pick it up. It might be due to a lot of reasons. Sometimes you may have not saved it, so it didn't recognize the file, or it didn't recognize the variable, so it won't auto import. So just try saving a couple times if that doesn't fix it. So let's go ahead into our app, and let's refresh, and you can see now we have our little contact form. Okay, and if we wanted to apply styles to this contact form, we can definitely do so. I can I can do something like I can create another class called input field, and I can say, oh, let's give it a width of 100%. Let's give it some padding. Let's just say the padding will be, let's just do top and bottom will be 20 pixels, and then actually let's do top, bottom, left, and right will all be 20 pixels. And let's also just specify the font family to be Poppins as well. And let's just copy and paste that, and let's just give that into our class name. And there we go. We have ourselves a little input field, and let me just go ahead and give it some box sizing. I don't want to get too off topic, but yep, there we go. Okay, we have a nice input field. Okay, so before we move on to the basics of the components, I want to do a couple more things. So what else you can also do inside the scope of your component, inside the functions of your components, is like similar in just regular JavaScript. If you've learned about closures, let's say for example, if I create a function called sum function, right? If you've learned about closures, you can actually declare variables such as sum field. You can declare functions like this. So let's just do something, and this can be equal to some function. Let's just say it's responsible for console logging some field, or let's just do value some field. And then when you invoke this function, you can invoke do something, or you can do something like return do something. And what will happen is it'll actually just call, let's just call this sum function. Okay, and not that it's going to do anything right now, nothing really important, but if we actually look at the console real quick, you can see that if I specify some random value, you can see that what's going on is that we're calling this sum function, and all of our variables that are defined in the closure of this function can be used, right? We can call do something inside some function, but I cannot call do something outside of that. Okay, that's just the basics of closure in JavaScript, and it's very important that you understand that. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because inside the closure of this contact form function, okay, this component, we can also do things such as declare our own variables too. So let's just say, username label, username, like that. And then if you wanted to evaluate this, so with React, you can actually evaluate expressions, and you would do that by using curly braces, like this. Okay, and then in between the curly braces, you would pass in the variable or the expression that you want to evaluate, and then it would just be displayed in the DOM. So if we go into our app, you can see that right over here. The username label is being displayed over there. Let me just capitalize that. Okay. And you can create, like I said, you can declare a bunch of functions. You can declare a bunch of variables, anything that you want. Okay. So we can also create a function that is responsible for handling our events. So when it comes to dealing with input fields, let's just say, for example, if you want to handle things asynchronously, let's say if you want to collect the user's the input value. Right now, the old way of doing that would be you would actually pass in the action, and that would be and all that data would be sent to some server, like some kind of some endpoint or some PHP server. Nowadays, most developers bind state variables to the actual input field, and so that way they can actually achieve input binding. So as you're typing certain things out, you can actually get the value of what the user is typing, and you can actually do whatever you want. You can validate it, you can submit it to an API, and etc. But we're not going to worry about that because that's going to require us to actually understand state and hooks, and we're going to worry about that later on. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that is going to basically be called every single time we type a value inside our input field. So in order to get that to work, we're going to have to use the onChange event. We're going to have to listen to that. Okay. Now, if you were to use regular JavaScript, you would actually need to do something like document.get element by ID. You would have to get the element by ID, or you can get it by class name, right? But usually you would get it by ID. And you can specify the ID, so some ID, and then you would add an event listener like that. You would do something like change, right? So you would do that if you were to use vanilla JavaScript. Well, in React, we can just pass in the onChange attribute. Well, you can call this like you can call this a JSX attribute because that's really what it is, right? And you can literally just pass in a function that is going to be invoked whenever this onChange event is emitted. Okay, so you can start to see why React it makes it a lot more simpler for developers. So let's go ahead and create a function. Let's just call it onChange. Ideally, you'd want to call this a function that is significant to what you're trying to do, but let's just call it onChange just for the sake of it. You can call it handle input, handle username input, etc., etc. And let's just console log e.target.value. Okay, and this should be very familiar if you've actually dealt with the events object when you were dealing with regular vanilla JavaScript. So right now, you're gonna see that as we're typing, it's logging every single thing. So if I type ABC, it's gonna log ABC. Okay. And like I said, because we're not actually keeping track of the value, the only way that we can get this value is by referencing e.target.value. But if we wanted to actually save it to the state, we would actually need to use the useState hook for this functional component. But like I said, for now, we're not going to worry about that. We'll worry about that when we get to React hooks. Okay. But for now, like I said, this is just the bare bones of components. Okay, so hopefully all of this stuff makes sense. Okay, so I think we've covered a decent amount when it came to just the basics of components. So far, I've shown you guys how to create very simple components, how to actually style your components using CSS. I've shown you examples of how you can pass in class names for the class name attribute. I've shown you the differences between like the brand new JSX attributes compared to the HTML attributes, so you know which ones to use. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna move on. In the next section of this tutorial, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you guys how component props work, and it's actually a very important concept that we need to talk about. So we're gonna move on to that real quick, and then after that, we're gonna talk about dynamic rendering. So these two things are actually gonna be very useful. So let's go ahead and create a new component. We're going to call this a user suggestion component. Okay, and this component is going to be reusable. So what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to pass in properties to this component, And so that way this component can actually render it out. So that way, instead of having to manually render multiple different div elements and render multiple different usernames and stuff, we can actually just create one component that we can use and pass in props, and it'll just do the trick for us. So for example, let's just say if I have some kind of feature that recommends users that you might want to be friends with, right? Let's say we have some kind of social media application, and this feature is this component, this module is responsible for recommending the top 5 suggestions for people that you might want to follow or be friends with. So your feature might look something like this. You might have a div tag, and you might have the user's username. So let's do a p tag. Let's just say username Anson, and let's just copy this a couple more times. Let's just say age. Let's do 23, and let's do location, New York. Okay, and well, let's just say you might want to do this a couple more times. So let's say you have 5 different users that you want to recommend. So let's do Bob, age 24, location New Jersey. Let's do that. Let's just do it one more time. Let's just do. Let's see. Bob. There's also Jake. Let's see, age 22. Let's just do Pennsylvania. And now we save. We can obviously see our application in the DOM. I'm sorry. See our changes in the DOM. Okay, but let's just say you don't necessarily know. What who those users are. Like, you don't know which ones are going to be returned from the external source, right? From the API, for example. And you're looking at this, and obviously this is not realistic because, well, first of all, this is literally hard-coded, and this is just fake data, obviously. You want to obviously render things based on what you're retrieving from the external source, whether it be an API, whether it be from a file, or, et cetera, right? And you can see that when we look at this, like, you might ask yourself, well, I can see that this div has 3 paragraph tags, and these paragraph tags pretty much render the same exact thing as a username, an age, and a location. So is there any way where I can create one component and use that component as a skeleton or as some kind of base structure for this user suggestion feature? And the answer to that question is yes. That is literally why that's really one of the main problems that React solves. So let's go ahead and delete all of this, and we're going to go ahead and go back into this user suggestion.jsx file. And like I said, dynamic rendering as well as component props are going to come in hand in hand. So I wanted to mention that real quick so you guys can understand that. So you guys can understand these two things better. Okay. So the idea is that we're going to create a component. Let's go ahead and do that. So export const user suggestion. Okay, and we're going to leave this as an empty. An empty parameter over here in between the function, in between the parentheses. Sorry, and we're gonna go ahead and simply just have this div render 3 p tags. We're gonna have this div have 3 p tags, and it's just gonna have a username. Okay, and we saw how variables were actually evaluated inside the contact form. So that's literally going to be the same way how we're going to evaluate the component props. So let's just go ahead and write out everything. Location. So I'm expecting 3 props. Okay, we're going to expect a username, an age, and a location. Okay, so now how do we actually pass in props? That is the question. Well, the way that you actually pass in attributes, it's literally the same thing. So for example, you saw how we passed in the class name attribute like that, and we passed in a value. It's the same way that we're going to pass in props. Okay, so what we're going to do is let's go ahead and import this user suggestion. Okay, right now if we look at the DOM, you can see that we're not returning anything. Let's do that real quick. You can see that we have 3 paragraph tags, but we don't have anything else after it. Okay, so we have our component being rendered, but we don't have properties. Okay, we don't have any properties passed down to the component. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pass down properties to this user suggestion component. So the way we do that is we're going to specify the name of the property that this component is expecting. So for example, let's say if this user suggestion component is expecting a username prop, well, the name of that prop is going to be called username. And like I said, it's going to look like an HTML attribute, but it's actually a prop. Okay, I'm just using that comparison. Okay, but don't actually call it an attribute, call it a prop. So user suggestion takes in this username prop, and we're going to pass in a hard-coded value for now. We'll pass in Anson. And so we had just passed in the property to user suggestion. Okay, now how do we actually get the property to show up inside our component, right? A better question is, how do we actually render that property? How do we get the value of username? Well, so every function is capable of taking in props. Okay, every function is capable of taking props, and it takes in one parameter called props. Now you can actually call this whatever you want, but the single parameter that this the single argument this function is going to take in is the props. Okay, so we can actually go ahead and console log props, and you can see in the console what it actually looks like. It's just going to be an object that has all of the props. You can see that we have this username prop right over here, and it has the value. Pretty straightforward, right? So if I wanted to, I can now evaluate props.username like this, and you can see that, oh, whoops, didn't mean to do the dollar sign. Sorry, I kind of just pulled an Angular moment right there, because in Angular you would do dollar sign and then double curly brace. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's curly brace and then the variable name, and that's how you can evaluate it. Okay, and you can see that Anson is being rendered in the DOM. Okay, I wish I can zoom in a little bit more. There we go. And then now let's pass in age and location for the props. So let's pass in age. So you can also pass in numeric values as well. You can pass in literally a bunch of different values. So let's pass in age, and let's pass in a number. So let's pass in 23. Okay. And if we look at the console real quick, you can see that it's actually also color coded too, and you can see that there's no strings, like it's not a string, like it's a number, like there's no quotes wrapped around it. So if you pass it as a number, it'll actually interpret as a number for the prop. Okay, and there's also location. So let's pass in location, and let's pass in New York. Okay. And let's go ahead and look at the console log. You can see now we have age, location, and username. Okay, and now we can actually just render everything. Whoops, didn't mean to do the dollar sign, sorry. So props.age, okay, and then props.location. And now we have a component that is dynamic and reusable. So I can literally just pass in properties, literally any value that I want, and it'll work just fine. Okay, hopefully you guys understand props and components a lot better now. Okay, I can literally pass in any value. So if I change this from Anson to Anderson, it'll literally show up as Anderson. Okay, if I change it from age 23 to age 24, it'll show up as 24. Okay, and if I change location from New York to, let's say, New Jersey, it would show up as New Jersey. So now that we can customize our props, what comes next in mind is, well, now I can actually build out a much more dynamic user suggestion feature. Because what we can do is we can actually reuse this component. So I apologize for not it's not wrapping. Let me go ahead and see if I can wrap the text. My prettier extension should actually be activating, but I don't know why it's not. Anyways, so let's go ahead and create another user suggestion component. And let's go ahead and do something like, this guy's name is Jake. Their age is, let's say their age is 30, and then they live in, let's say they live in Texas, for example, right? And then now you can see we have another user component or user suggestion component. And if we were to look at the DOM, you can see that like these things literally just resolve to regular divs. Okay? Very, 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 very straightforward. Okay, so we have a username, age, and location, and we can create another component. We can render another user component, and let's just say Laura, let's say age 36, and location California, and we can see that that is being displayed in the DOM right over there. Very straightforward. Now, like I said, we have another problem. What if I don't want to hard code all of these users? Right now, we can reuse this component. Okay, and let's actually just wrap this inside a div. We can reuse this user suggestion component, right? Let's just type h1. Let's just say suggested users. Okay, but I don't want to hard code everything because the data might change, right? And like I said, you don't want to hard code it because that's just not really efficient, and it's not really efficient because when you have the correct tools that you can use to solve certain problems, you might as well use it. So how do we actually make it so that we can actually render as many users as we need to without actually having to hard code it? Because sometimes, because maybe you might want to change it from 5 to 10, right? But it would look like a disaster if you were to hard code it, like, let's say X number of times. So let's actually fix that problem right now that we have. So let's just go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a array, and we're going to just pretend like this is, this comes from some API, right? So let's just say, let's say const users, okay? And every user is going to follow the schema. So let's just say Anderson, age 24, and then location, New Jersey, okay? And let's go ahead and pass in Jake, 30. I think you guys get the idea of what we're doing here. We are just creating a simple array, and we're going to pretend, like I said, this is coming from some API. Okay, this could come from an API, this could come from a file, okay, literally anything. In a real world application, usually comes from an API, maybe some file, who knows, right? Or it could be hard-coded, I don't know, it's up to the user on how they want to implement it. Okay, so we have our array, we have this users array. This is an array of user objects, okay, it all follows the same schema. And what we're going to do now is we want to basically render each one of these as a JSX element, okay? So the way that we do this in React is actually pretty cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a curly brace, and what these curly braces are going to allow us to do, it's basically going to allow the JSX parser to interpret all the syntax inside of the curly braces. Remember, the curly braces allow you to evaluate like what's inside of it. So for example, variables, state variables, props, you can evaluate expressions, right? What we're going to do is we're going to use it to evaluate a JSX. Now, in order to do that, we actually need to transform this users array. We're going to basically run through the users array. We're going to take every single user object, and we're going to return JSX. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to pass in the users variable. We're going to call .map. Remember, this is an array, so the map function is going to work on this. Okay, now the map function is a very important function that you should definitely understand. If you do not understand it, I highly recommend you look up what the map function does, because you're going to be using this a lot, and you're going to have a hard time really understanding what's going on if you don't understand what the map function does. But just to give you a brief understanding of what it does, what this map function does is it's going to basically go through this users array. Okay, the map function takes in a transformer function. Okay, this function is responsible for taking each element inside the array that we're applying the transformation on, and it's going to literally apply a transformation. It can either do things such as add an extra letter. It can multiply the number by 10. It can it can also call a function and return the value of that function with that parameter. It can do a lot of things. What we want to do is we want to return JSX. Okay, so let's first pass in this function. Okay, let's pass in this function. And remember, this is just a callback function, and this callback function has a value, and that value is whatever whatever schema, whatever object this is, or it could be anything. It could be a schema, like an object. It can be a username. It could be anything. And like I said, we'll play around with this in this tutorial series. Okay, so this value over here is going to be a user object. So let's just say user, and we're going to use arrow syntax. And what we want to do is we want to return a user suggestion. Okay, So we need to pass in these props. If we don't pass in those props, we're actually going to get an error. That's going to, well, actually, it's not going to error, but like it's not going to show. Well, if this was TypeScript, it would throw an error, but it's actually supposed to render these username things, but since it's undefined, it's not going to render it. So now what we need to do is we need to pass in the appropriate props, the same way that we did it before. So earlier we passed it in by just pretty much specifying the name of the prop. So username, okay, and that is going to be user. So that is going to be the parameter of this callback function, okay, and we're going to reference username, just like that, okay. Likewise, age is going to be user.age, and then location is going to be user.location. Okay, so the same thing that we did up and above earlier in this tutorial, we're just doing it, but we're doing the same exact thing with rendering the component and passing in the props. But this time, what we're doing is we are taking the array, we're mapping each object so that what happens is that this new array is actually going to be an array of JSX elements, and that is going to be evaluated. Okay, that's going to be evaluated by the JSX parser. And you can see that these components are now being rendered dynamically. So if I really wanted to, I can actually add more and more users. I can change this name to, let's say, Daniel. I can change the location to, let's say, Washington. And you can see that it's going to be added to the DOM, and I didn't need to do anything else. So this is the power of dynamic rendering. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't, don't worry. In the next section of this video, I'm actually going to show you guys another example so that you guys can better understand what's really going on. But like I said, to really understand what's going on, you really do need to understand the map function. And like I said, that's just a prerequisite. That's just like a prerequisite. You need to make sure you understand JavaScript and the functions. Okay. But yeah, hopefully this whole section made sense when it came to components, component properties, as well as dynamic rendering. Like I said, I'm going to show you guys a couple more examples with dynamic rendering. So stay tuned, and we're going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so in the last tutorial, I showed you guys how to dynamically render all of your users. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys another example real quick. And this is going to be a fairly simple example. I'll just create a simple component, and I'll call this, let's just say, list of foods. Okay, I'll call it a food list.jsx. Okay, and let's go ahead and create this food list function. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let's just say this is just going to be a simple. This is just going to be a very simple, a very simple component. It's just going to return a. Let's just say it'll return a list element, and it's going to take in a prop. It's going to take in a prop called name, and instead of just taking in the props parameter as an object, remember this is just a single object. We can actually destructure it like this, and we can actually just do return name like that. So we don't have to reference props on name. It would just be name because we are destructuring the props inside the function. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead inside let's see, root.jsx, and let's go ahead and create a list of foods. So let's just leave const foods, and this isn't going to be anything special. It's just going to be let me actually just delete all of this because we won't really need it anymore. Or actually, you know what I'll do? Let me go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and do this. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and create all of our foods inside the root.jsx file. So let's do banana, or let's do banana, pizza, French fries. A lot of unhealthy foods except for the banana. What are some healthier foods? Apples, or apple, singular. What else is there? Salad, carrots, cucumbers, chicken. Let's let's see, avocado. Okay, so we have a list of foods. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a component called food.jsx. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this component. So this component is kind of going to just be like a parent component that's going to take care of having all the logic that has to deal with foods. Because like I said, you don't want to put everything inside the root.jsx file. So we're going to do export const food. Okay, and this food component is going to take in the list of foods. So we're going to go ahead and actually destructure the foods over here as props. Okay, and let's go ahead and just return a simple div for now. And let's just do a simple h1 tag food list. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and render this component. So div food, and we need to pass in the foods prop. So I'm going to do that by just passing in foods is equal to foods. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just, like I said, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I'm going to console log foods just so that you guys can see what's going on. So you can see food list is being displayed in the DOM. That's coming from this h1 tag that's inside this food component, which is being rendered inside root.jsx. We're passing in this foods list, okay, that is being defined in this root.jsx. But this could, like I said, this could be coming from a file. This could be coming from an API. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to render this food list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and simply do the same thing that we were doing in the last section of the tutorial. We're going to dynamically render the foods. So foods we know is an array. So we're going to do foods.map. Okay. And now IntelliSense is not going to recognize any of this because we actually don't have because we're using JavaScript and it's not really going to do any type checking for us. If you want, you can actually use prop types, but that's out of the scope of this tutorial. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we know that each element inside this foods array is just a string. So what we're gonna do is we're actually going to need to render a list element. So if you want, you can actually leave that inside this food list. But let me actually go ahead and wrap this inside an unordered list. And we're going to go ahead and simply just return a food list element, just like that. And right now, you're actually going to see a bunch of bullet points with nothing in there. That's because we haven't passed in the food element or the food prop yet. Okay. And now, actually, let me actually change this to food name because just so I don't want to have any confliction. Okay. So now you'll see all of the foods. So let's actually, so this is just a fairly simple example. So let's actually just walk through this real quick because I know we kind of like sped through this. So what we did was we created a div and we used this div to wrap this food component. So this food component is just going to be like a wrapper component that's going to hold like, some metadata of the food list. Right, you can style it. It's basically you want to like create like a wrap around the actual list. Okay, so what we did was we created an unordered list, and inside this unordered list we are doing the same that we did over here with the users. We are calling .map on the array, the foods array, and what we're doing here is we are returning JSX. We're returning the food list, which is this component over here. And it takes in a prop called food name, and all it does is it just returns a list item. I think that's what li stands for. I think that's what li stands for, list item, right? So list item is a child of the unordered list, and you can actually also style this list item to if you want to. Okay, so you keep all those styles separate from the actual unordered list itself. And so pretty much since there's let's say there's how many elements are there's 9 elements, so each one of these every single one of these string elements gets transformed into a JSX element, because remember, like I said, .map is going to literally take in a transformation function. That's the callback function over here, and remember this callback function is literally returning food list. Okay, if I actually didn't return this food list element, if I just did hi, right, we'll actually we would actually get an error right over here because hold on, let me see if I can fix this. Okay, there we go. Yeah, we were getting an error because of that, because we just had a syntax error. But you can see that whatever this callback function was returning is what is going to be evaluated in between the curly braces. Okay, now since we are returning high, well, every single element that's inside foods was transformed from the original element to high. Okay, if you actually were to console log, if you were to actually console log the result of this, I think I should have done this earlier. You can actually see this a lot better. So on line 4, we were console logging foods, and on line 5, we're console logging the transformation of foods using the .map function. So you can see we have all of these strings inside the array. Okay, and over here we have a React element. Okay, so notice how it went from strings, banana, pizza, french fries, to an actual React element. And these are actual valid JSX elements that can actually be rendered in the DOM. Okay, so I hope these two examples help you better understand dynamic rendering. Okay, and like I said, you just have to keep on practicing. So I'd highly recommend, as a separate exercise, you create your own components and you create your own mock lists and you try your best to render them. And try passing in, different prop types, pass in different props, play around with it, and you'll get better. So hopefully all of this makes sense. Okay, and I think in the next section of the tutorial, we're going to move on to conditional rendering. I think that's also something very important that we need to talk about. So let's move on to that. All right, guys, so welcome back to the next section of this tutorial. So hopefully you guys have taken a break because there's been a lot of stuff that we've been talking about. So I definitely want you guys to make sure that you're taking your time with this tutorial. The whole point is not to rush this. The reason why I'm going in such in depth, I could have made a shorter video, but I don't know, I wanted to make this to be much more in depth to make sure that my explanations are much more clear, concise, get straight to the point, and making sure that you guys understand with lots of examples. So I highly recommend you guys take breaks, make sure you actually understand what's going on, and don't just watch the whole video and call it a day. Actually make sure you're understanding what exactly is going on. Okay, anyways, let's get back to the tutorial. So what we're going to do in this section of the tutorial is we're going to go ahead and talk about conditional rendering. Okay, and conditional rendering should kind of be self-explanatory, because if you hear the word conditional, the first thing that should go through your head are conditions, like true or false values, right? That thing should really go through your head. Conditional rendering. Okay, well, let's talk about what exactly is conditional rendering with an example. So let's just say for example, let's say I only want to display an element if the user has clicked on a button. Okay, if the user just visited our website and they did not click on the button, they do not get to see the content. But once they click that button, they can see the content. Okay, so that is an example of conditional rendering, because you're only rendering whatever content based on some kind of condition. And in React, you can actually take this to the next level. You can choose what you want to render. You can choose what the user gets to see based on some kind of conditional value. It can be whether or not, in their time zone, whether or not it's currently, morning, whether it's currently nighttime. You can create a condition whether or not the user is authenticated, so you can protect certain web pages in your application. You can render, something based on whether or not they are eligible. If there's a lot of things, right? If they're eligible for, some kind of discount, you can render a discount form for them so they can pay a lower price. There's a lot of examples that you can think about. I'm sure that you guys can try to think about many different things you can do with conditional rendering, and it's very important that you understand this. So let's go ahead and get to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just create a simple example. So let's just say I want to display a simple string in the document based on some kind of condition. So let's go back to our root.jsx file. And I know this is starting to get a little bit messy. So what we're going to do is we'll just delete all this, because honestly, it's really not that much code. And You know, it shouldn't be really super. I don't think you guys really need to rely too much on these. On these, we can always like revert back to when we need it. So I'll just let me just do this real quick. Let me copy and paste this. Let me move this out of the way because I really want to make it a lot more cleaner. So actually, I'll just delete it. I'll just delete it. Okay, so let's go back to what we had before. Hello world. Okay, and let's go ahead and let's do this. So let's just say, for example, let's say I have this contact form, right? Let's say I only want to render this contact form based on some variable, and we'll start with a simple example. Let's just say let's create a variable called show form. Okay, and let's just set this to true. And this is just a simple example. Okay, and let's go ahead and do this. Let's say the way we would do this, we would wrap this inside a curly brace, and we would use an expression, right? So there's many ways that you can do this. You can either do show form and contact form. Okay, so this would only render the contact form if both of these are true. Remember the AND operator, right? The AND operator. Remember what that does, right? It's the AND logical operator. Remember, it will only evaluate to true if both of these are true. So if show form is true and contact form is actually truthy, then it will render contact form. Okay, so if we look at it, you can see that the form is being rendered. Okay, now what if I change show form to false? Let's manually change it to false, and you'll see that it's not being rendered, right? What if I wanted to, let's say for example, if I wanted to render hello world based on, you know, some kind of truth value. So if I wanted to do this, I can say, you know, true and hello world, and you can see that hello world is not being rendered. And if it's false, hello world disappears, or it was never rendered in the first place. Let me rephrase that. Hello world was never rendered in the first place. Not that it disappears, because it was never there in the first place. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. So I made a mistake on that real quick. Okay, so hello world is being rendered, and if we change this to false, hello world is never being rendered. Okay, so this is pretty cool because now you can choose what you want to display to the user. Let's say, for example, you are creating some kind of application, and your application, you know, has some kind of like reward system, and you only want to display a reward when they reach, let's say, level 25, right? Well, you can show them that reward once they reach level 25. You can say, okay, if user is level 25, or if they reach a certain, you know, level, show some kind of message to the user. Okay, very, very, very cool feature that we can do with conditional rendering in React. Okay, so hopefully that itself makes sense. And let me show you a couple of other examples some other examples that you might run into as well. So let's just say we want to render two different components based on the truth value. So let's say a good example would be, let's say the user either wants to register or they want to log into your application. Okay, so let's go ahead and create two forms real quick. We'll just simply create a register form, and these will be simple forms, and a login form.jsx. And I'll just do like some simple copy and pasting. So let's just do a simple export const register form. And I honestly think that with all these examples, you guys should definitely get the hang of it over time. Okay, so let's go ahead and do const. Let's do username label, username, const password label is equal to password, then const confirm password label is equal to confirm password. So I'm just setting up the labels because I don't want to hard code the strings in the label. Okay, and we're gonna go ahead and do a simple return statement, and we're gonna return a form. And then this form is just going to have a couple of fields. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste what I have from the contact form, but I'm going to change up some stuff. So for the ID, I'm going to change this to form. Let's just change this to form register username. And we'll get rid of the on change event because we're not going to really care about that. And let's change this ID to form register username. Want to be consistent. Okay, and let's just go ahead and create two more labels. So we'll do password, so form register password, okay, and we'll do password label, and then we'll do one more, whoops, that was that was from prettier. That curly brace thing. So let's do form register confirm, not const. Form register confirm. Okay, and let's do this. Okay, and you can also combine strings too. Like if you really wanted to, you could do something like, you could do confirm password label. You can do that if you want, or you can also add in template strings too if you wanted to. It's up to you. So if I wanted to do, for example, if I wanted to do this, right? If I wanted to do this, I could do that if I really wanted to. But I'll just leave it alone. I'll just leave it like this for now. Okay, so let's also just do one more thing with the input field. I'll just do a type password. Okay. Okay, so we have our register form, and let's just copy and paste this and paste inside the login form. It's really just going to look the same thing, minus the confirm. Okay, let's just get rid of that, and we'll just change this to form login username, because you definitely don't want the same IDs. Okay, and let's just also add a button just for convenience. Okay, let's just do button login. Okay, and then let's just do a button register. Okay, so let's just say, for example, I only want to show, I want to show a component based on a condition. But let's say, for example, if I want to show either the register form or the login form. So how would I do this? So let's just say let's just pretend we have some kind of variable, and this will be a lot more. This will actually be a lot more cool once we actually get into useState. But let's just say show register form is set to true. Okay, so let's just say that this is going to be some page, and we're going to go ahead and check the variable. If show register form is true, we're going to return register form. Okay, now we're going to get an error. We're actually going to not get an error, because right now it's actually returning GSX. But if this was set to false, we should actually get an error. Okay, because it will say nothing was mounted. Though I'm not sure why it didn't throw an error before, because I think in TypeScript usually it would throw an error, because if this was set, remember if this was false, nothing would be returned, and that would actually throw an error in TypeScript. But anyways, so what we should do is we should also say else. Let's return the login form. Oh, I think I accidentally called it login form. Okay, else return login form, just like that. Okay, so now right now we have the register form, but if I change this value to false, you can see we have the, oh, I'm sorry, before we had the register form, after I changed the value of show register form to false, I have the login form now. So you can see how conditional rendering can be very powerful. You can render things based on literally just a condition, and again, that condition can be anything. Okay, and a shorthand way to do this is you can also do a ternary operator. So you can do a return show register form. If that's true, return register form. And if that's false, it will return login form. So this is just a simple shortcut. So instead of doing that, you can do this. Okay. And like I said, you can make this as dynamic as you want. So I mean, I guess maybe let me see if I can think of a good example real quick. So let me actually do this. Let me actually go ahead and log the path name real quick, just so I can see what's being logged. Okay, great. Now let me actually go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that when I visit, let's say, register, it should say register. Okay, and if I visit login, it should be login. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're gonna implement our own little mini, like a little bootleg router. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna check the path name, and we're gonna get this from window.location. So I'm actually just gonna destructure this real quick. Okay, and let's just do this. So instead of having a hard-coded value now, we can actually check to see if the path name is equal to /register, return register form. Else, if path name is equal to /login, return login form. And let's do a default case too. So if none of these conditions are true, we'll just return a div, and we'll just say hello world. Okay, now let's see what happens. So if I go to /login, you'll see that I have the login form now. If I go to just the slash route, the base route, it will just say hello world as we have described it over here. And if I go to /register, that'll give me the register form. So we just kind of like created a mini like router over here. Okay, but the whole point was to show you guys how we can conditionally render stuff. Okay, and what we're doing right now is we're conditionally rendering a component based on the location, that based on the path name that we are at. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you guys understand conditional rendering a lot more better. And I hope I was able to cover a lot of the base cases. You can also use I think you can also use switch cases as well. Okay, but I'm not going to get into that. I think I covered the basics for you guys. All right, guys, so in this section, we're going to talk about state in React, and we're going to also talk about the differences between props and state. And I'm going to try my best to give you guys a couple of examples with how we can actually deal with component in state in our component. Okay, so what exactly is state? So pretty much state describes our components, and they keep track of values that can control the logic and the view of it. So for example, let's say if we were to go back to our original forms that we created, let's say we want to keep track of what the user is typing for their username or email address, even better, right? And let's say they're typing in an invalid email address, so we want to keep track of that, because if they type in an invalid email address, we want to be able to display an error message to it. So based on the state of the email address, if it's an invalid email address, the component will know, right? The component will know that, hey, listen, this is an invalid email address. I'm going to display an error message telling the user that this is invalid and you need to fix it. And let's say if they do end up fixing their email address, well, the error message goes away. So that's a good example of behavior based on a certain value of a state variable. Okay, and state can change over time throughout your component. For example, maybe the user state can transition from authenticated to unauthorized once they perform some kind of event, right? That's just one simple example. All right, so let's just move on. Let's talk about props and state. So I have to mention this because a lot of people might end up getting confused between the two of them, because they think that, oh, they both look like objects. Why can't we just treat them as the same thing? The truth is that yes, they are, you can think of them as objects, but reality is that they are not the same exact thing. And props in general are supposed to be used to pass data. So if we were to go back to our example of the contact form, we would only want to pass data into the contact form if there were any, and we would only want to use them as read-only. We would not want to modify them at all. When it comes to state, however, state is for managing its own data for its own component, right? So for example, state can be changed based on events. So if we were to go back to the contact form or login form, right? Let's say if the user types in an invalid username, well, based on that event, we can update some kind of state variable that indicates that an error just occurred, right? Let's say if we are fetching data from an API, we would possibly we can update the state of some variable indicating to the user that we're currently fetching data, or it's loading. And then when we get the data back from the API, we can update the state of loading and say it's no longer loading, so that, let's say, maybe the loading screen would stop showing right after the request is done, right? So that's just a couple of examples. State changes over time. We can do a lot of things to trigger state changes, and whenever a state value changes, the component is re-rendered. So like I said, when it comes to state, you do not want to treat state as if it's a prop, and you don't want to treat prop as if it's a state. They're two different things, two different concepts, and you definitely do not want to confuse the two of them at all. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on some examples of state. Okay, so we're going to introduce something called a React hook. Okay, and if you don't know what a React hook is, they're basically just functions. Okay, they're basically just functions that pretty much keep track of some kind of state value, and then they could give you that state value back, and you can use it for your application. Okay, so it's a new addition in React 16.8, but as of right now, we're actually using React version 17. So React hooks have actually been out for a while, and just a little bit of history. Back then, if you wanted state for your component, you would actually need to use classes, right? You would actually need to use classes because classes were the only class-based components were the only things that could actually support states. Okay, but ever since they introduced React hooks, well, thankfully with React hooks you can actually have a stateful component for functional components, right? Because generally when it comes to functions versus classes, functions generally aren't an instance, right? Functions are not instances, right? Classes, you can have instance of a class, but you can't have an instance of a function. So there's no there's no such things as like instance variables, instance methods, things like that. Those don't exist on a function. But because of hooks, we can actually have those in functions now. And the reason why most people don't really use class-based components nowadays is because ever since hooks, we can have stateful functional components, and functional components actually are a lot more cleaner, and it's a lot less code, and it's just generally a lot more better, honestly, at least in my opinion, and a lot of people also can say the same too. And like I said, it just generally looks clean. Like if you were to compare a class-based code to a class-based component code to a functional-based component code, you would see a huge, tremendous difference between the two. But then again, it does depend on how the developer intends on writing the component. But anyways, we'll actually go over class-based components later on, but we'll save that for later. Okay, so like I said earlier, React hooks pretty much allow you to use state, and you can actually use other React features. You can actually create custom React hooks that keep track of state for you, but we'll get to that when we get into a more advanced tutorial. Okay, so we're only going to use the useState hook in this section, and we're going to use the useState hook to keep track of our form. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete a couple of things that are just not necessary because I just don't want to have a lot of useless components in our code because we already have a lot of things already. So I'm going to go ahead and just simply do this. Let me go ahead and I'm only going to have the register form and the login form. And we're going to go ahead and go into our root.jsx. Okay, so let's go back to our app. Let's just make sure everything works. Okay, so great, perfect. So we have our register component, and let's go into this register component, this register form component. And what I want to do is I want to keep track of the state of every single field. But for now, we'll just keep track of the username field, which is just going to be this first input field over here. Okay. Now keep in mind these variables over here, these are not state variables. Remember, these are just defined variables that we can use. We cannot actually use this to update states. Okay. So just to make it clear, you cannot use these to actually update state. Okay, in order for you to actually have a state variable in your component, you need to use the useState hook no matter what. Okay, so we're going to use the useState hook. Okay, it just works exactly like that. It's literally just a function that you invoke. Okay, and it's imported from React. Now, if you also want to do this, you can also import React, and you can also just do react.useState. That also works as well. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter too much. It's just personal preference. But we're just going to call the useState hook. And what happens here is that the parameter that is passed into this useState is the initial state of your state variable. Okay? So first of all, before we pass in any value, any initial value, let's actually understand what exactly it is that we're trying to keep track of for this state variable. Well, we're trying to keep track of this input field for username. So let's name our state variable. Let's call it username. Okay, you can call it username field if you want, but I like to keep it nice and simple. So let's say username and then set username. Okay, now you're probably wondering what exactly is going on here. Okay, so basically underneath the hood, React is going to, React useState, the useState hook is going to return an array, okay? And that array is going to have two elements in that array. It's going to have the value of the state variable based on, okay, so when you first call it, and if you don't pass anything, it's going to be undefined. You can even see in the IntelliSense in the documentation over here that when you first call it and if you don't pass anything, it'll return undefined. Okay. The second parameter, the second return value, which is this set username. Okay. So notice how it's an array and it has two elements, and we're actually destructuring this, right? So this username variable is the actual state variable, and this set username variable is actually a function. And you can think of this function as a setter in a class, okay? It's responsible for actually updating the state variable, okay? So we can't actually use variables like username label and do stuff like, we can't do stuff like, username label is equal to, something else. You can't do that, okay? So what we need to do is we need to use the useState hook. It's going to give us back two values, the username and the set username. Now you can obviously name these whatever you want. You don't have to call it set username, but it's just better if you name it something that like tells the developer that this is a function that is used to change the value of username. So that's why most people go by this convention. So the name of the actual state variable and then the function, okay, set username. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and just leave the initial value as an empty string. Okay, so now you can actually see if I hover over the documentation, it will say initial state, which is a string. Okay, so you can put in whatever you want. And let me just show you some cool stuff. Let's just say the username is Anson, and if I were to actually render this out, let's go ahead and render username out. We can actually see that we have Anson being displayed over here. Perfect. Okay, cool. So now here's what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically bind our input field to the state variable username. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that every single time the input field every single time the onChange event is being emitted, we want to make sure that whatever is being typed into the input field is also going to be stored inside username. So if I type A in the input box, it's also going to be stored in username. If I type B, A and then B, it's going to be, the username is going to be AB. Okay, and then if I type C afterwards, the state of username is going to be A, B, C. And if I keep on going, if I, delete, if I, copy and paste, etc., it's going to give me whatever it is that's in the input field. Okay, so to do that, we need to listen to events. Remember earlier from what we talked about in the slides that state can change based on events, button clicks, input fields being changed, literally anything, any event that you can think about. So for this event, we're going to use the onChange event, and this onChange event is going to take in a function that's going to be invoked every single time the onChange event is emitted. So whenever the value of the input changes. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and just create I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it on username change, just to be more precise. Because like I said, we do have different fields as well to worry about. Okay. So remember that the event handler, is always going to have the event parameter. Okay. That's the event object. Okay. If you hover over here, it will literally tell you it has the event handler. Okay. And like I said, if I were to actually console log e.target.value, it would give me the value that is being typed into the input field. So if I open up my console, if I type in username, you can see that this is what event.target.value is, but that's not what username is. So that's what we're trying to update. So what we want to do is every single time we type something, so for example, if I type A, right? Well, the value of e.target.value is A, but I want to update username so that I can actually get the value of username to be A. Okay, and what I'll do is let me actually go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and put a p tag, and I'm going to render the username just so that we can see it. Okay, so right now we can't see anything because, like I said, the username is still the username is still Anson. It's actually hard. Let me actually remove this real quick. Okay, we can't really see anything because there's no value. Okay, and we aren't updating the username yet, but let me actually go ahead and update it by calling set username. And we're going to go ahead and pass in what we want to actually set the username to. So that would basically be e.target.value, right? So if I go ahead, if I type A, you can see that now it's actually displaying A. Let me actually, let me zoom in real quick. This is a little bit hard to see. Let me zoom in. So if I type, let me delete it. If I type A, you're going to see that the state of username is A. And if I want to write some better log state of username, okay, state of username A. If I type N, S-O-N, if I delete, works the same way. If I want to type some other stuff. If I want to copy and paste, works the same way. Whenever the input changes, it's going to call this function, okay? We call this an event handler. And it's going to call the setter, the set username function, and it's going to update the value of username. And remember, every single time the state changes, the component itself is going to be re-rendering. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense, and you can start to understand why this is actually very powerful. Okay? And we can do the same thing with password too. Let's say if I want to control the state of password, I can do the same thing for that too. So we can create another state variable called password, and the setter is going to be called set password. Remember, the setter is going to be used to change the value, to change the state value. Okay. Oh, whoops. Let me actually move that up here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and write over, let's see, right over, over here in input. We're going to go ahead and use the onChange function, and whenever the onChange event is emitted by this password label, by this password field, we're going to call the on password change. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and just create that function right over here, and it's going to take in the event object, and we're going to go ahead and call set password, and then we're going to pass an e.target.value, and again, it works the same exact way. And let me go ahead and just type in state of password, and we're going to render password to the DOM. So now if I type here, you're going to see ASD. Same thing happens here, and these state variables are independent from each other. Okay, username is completely independent from password, so whatever is being altered for username is not going to affect password at all. Okay, and that's pretty much it when it comes to updating state based on input, right? And I can also update state based on this register button, right? So for example, I can go ahead and say const. Let's do something where let's do a simple example of a loading set loading. So let's say whenever the button is clicked, we're going to go ahead and indicate that the user has submitted something, and we're currently in a loading state. Okay, and then after some time, the loading state is going to go from true to false. Okay, so right now the state of loading is false. Okay, and after some time, once the button is clicked, after some time, we're going to set the loading to true when the button is clicked, and then after some time, we're going to set it to false. So let's go ahead and do this const on button click. Okay, and so you can call it whatever you want, but I'll just call it this, on button click. And we'll use the on click event. Okay, and we also need to make sure we are using we're calling event.prevent default, because if I click this, you're gonna see that we have that question mark there, and it's gonna refresh everything, and you don't want that to happen. I mean, you could, but like most of the time, like I said, most of the time, in modern day like web applications, we don't really use that action path anymore. We actually just use fetch or Axios to submit the data to the server, like the Ajax calls is what you would refer to it. Okay, so we got to call e.prevent default, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and just call set loading, and we're gonna set this to true. So you're gonna see that set loading is going to go from false to true, and I'm gonna show you guys how we can actually see that. Okay, and what we're gonna do is after some time, so maybe let's say after let's say 5 seconds, we will set the loading state to false. So 5 seconds. So set timeout will take in milliseconds for time, so we have to do 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. And what I'm going to do is when the state is loading, we're going to disable the button. So disabled is going to, the button is going to be disabled when loading is true. Okay, so watch this. So I'm going to click on register. You can see that it's currently disabled, and now it's going to be enabled after 5 seconds. See how that worked? Pretty cool. And like I said, you can make even more complex applications too. Let's say once you click this button, you can do some form validation, right? You can check to see if the user has entered an empty username, or if they've entered a valid username, and if they actually provided an empty username. So for example, let's go over here on button click, and let's actually create another state variable. It's called const errors, set errors. Okay, and we can create a state variable for this, and we can actually make this an object. Okay, and we can say, okay, let's say there's a couple errors, right? We can have a username error, we can have a password error, and we can have a confirm password error. And it's actually good that I'm covering this use state with an object, because I'm going to show you guys how to actually update state when it comes to objects. Okay, so let's just say, for example, let's just get rid of all this real quick. Let's just say we're going to do some validation, right? Let's just say if let's see, if username, let's just do a simple validation. So if there's no so if the username is not, if the username is truthy, then set errors is going, so the username error is going to be fine. If the password is non-empty, that's going to be, the error is going to be fine as well. If confirm password, we're going to make sure all of these, oh, we didn't actually even do a password. Okay, you know what, let me actually get rid of, I'm just going to like get rid of the password field real quick. So I'm just going to deal with these two just to make it simpler. Okay, great. So if username, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we set the errors to none, right? So if there is no username, right? If there is no username, then we're going to say, hey, look, you got to enter a value for username, right? So let's say if username else. So let's just do this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to handle the else case first, okay? So what we want to do is we want to update the state of errors, because remember, this is an object. This isn't like a string or a boolean anymore. We actually can't just do set errors and do this. We actually can't just do that. Okay? So what we need to do is we need to actually create a clone of the original state, and this is how you'd actually do that in class-based components. You would create a clone of the state, of the original state. You would update the value of the clone, okay? And then you would update the entire state. You would place the state with the clone with the updated value. Awesome. So let's go ahead and do that. So if there's no username, so we're in this else case, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say let's see, new errors, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're going to basically just we're gonna create a copy of this, and by using the structure, the spreader operator. So what this will do is it'll basically unpack all the fields and errors, all the current fields. So we're taking the current state, because remember, there might be some values already here. So we don't want to interfere with the values that we don't want to touch. So we just want to update the username property inside this object. Okay. So we're gonna create a clone of this. Okay. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and do new errors dot username is equal to please enter a username. Okay, and then after we're gonna call set errors, and we're gonna pass a new error. So that is how you update state for an object. Okay, you cannot just do set errors. You cannot just do this where you do username and then that, because this would actually remove like the current state of password. Okay, so you can't do that. Okay, so this is one way that you can do it. One of the correct ways you can do it. You create a copy, right? An entirely new copy of the object, and then you modify the new object, and then you call set errors. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now if I actually were to, let's actually test this out. Let's make sure that it works. So if I click register, wait, actually, let me actually go ahead and do this. So we're gonna update the errors, right? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna bring in our conditional rendering skills to the test, right? We're gonna go ahead and put the error message right on top of this username label. So let me actually just get rid of state of username instead of password, and we're gonna go and say errors username. Okay. Hold on. Let's refresh the page. Okay. Let me actually put this in the p tag. Okay. So right now you can see that the error message is not being displayed because errors.username, the value of this is falsy because it's just an empty string. If I were to actually type something here, that would be displayed. Okay. Now if I click on register, you're going to see that it says please enter username. So what actually happened was when we clicked on this button, we triggered the on click event, and that calls this on button click function. Okay. We check to see if the username is truthy, and that's this username field. Okay, that's controlling that's controlling the value of whatever the username is, whatever the user's entering for the username. So if that field is empty, we're gonna go ahead and update the state of errors, and we're gonna display new errors.username is going to be please enter a username. Okay. Now you also have to handle the case where if there is in fact a username, right? If it's truthy, then what we need to do is we need to actually we should clear the error, and it's just going to be the same exact thing too. So what I can actually do is I can just copy and paste this right over here, and I can just change this to this. Okay, so basically we're doing the same thing. We're creating a copy of the original state. We're modifying the new copy. We're setting the new copy using to an empty string. Okay, and then we're updating the actual state. So if I refresh, if I click register, it's going to show this. If I type in something, it's going to say, and if I click this button again, it's going to disappear. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And like I said, the same thing would apply for password, right? You would do the same exact thing. And I could probably, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if the password, we're going to update new errors.password, set that to a falsy value for string. And then if the password is not truthy, we're going to say please enter a password. And obviously this is just a very simple example of a form. You'd obviously create a more sophisticated value. Let's see what's going on over here. Oh, so it seems like we have a problem. So it seems like this wouldn't actually work because we actually are checking the username and the password. So that's not necessarily good, because what's happening down here is that the state over here is actually overriding. It's actually overriding the state from before. So let's see. It shouldn't though, because we actually, let's see. We have if username, we're gonna update the username, and if password, let's see what's going on here. It might be because I think it might be because errors did not update on time, because state can actually update. Like let's say if I get rid of this, for example, this should work, right? And I know that this itself works. This should actually display. There's the password. Okay, but yeah. So because state can actually also, state is never guaranteed to update synchronously. So because this is happening, you can see that the username is getting overridden. So what we can actually do is we can actually move this up here. So we create a copy of that, and I think that should probably be okay. So if the username is, so this part over here will control the username. So if username, new errors.username will be empty, set the errors, okay. This is obviously not going to be touched, but then if it goes to password, okay, so this should probably do the trick. There we go, perfect. So we move the new, so we create the copy all the way up top, perfect. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And if I were to click on this, that should disappear. Click on this, that should disappear. If I remove the value, please enter a password. Please enter a username, and there we go. So hopefully this example, I know it's pretty lengthy, but I hope this example really gives you guys more insight on how we can actually use the useState hook. You know, I know it's pretty lengthy, but like I said, the whole point is to go in depth as much as I can to show you guys a simple, not really simple, but like a more advanced, you know, like an example that you would probably end up using in a real world application. Okay, so hopefully this useState hook makes sense, and I really hope you guys understood everything. I really hope you guys understand how to update the state, how to actually evaluate the state by rendering the actual value of the state. And I encourage you guys to try, you know, your own, you know, try creating your own components with your own state and playing around with it. Okay, so that's going to be pretty much it for this section of the tutorial. So I think this should probably conclude the whole entire state. The whole entire state of the actual like React component state section. So in the next section of the tutorial, we're going to cover useEffect, and that'll actually be the final thing that we cover. In that, we're actually going to cover a lot of things. I'm going to show you guys how to actually fetch data from an API. I'm going to show you guys how to use useEffect. And I'm going to explain to you guys how useEffect actually works so you guys can understand what it does. And I think after covering useEffect, everything should pretty much be like you guys should probably have all of the core fundamentals of React underneath your belt. And then we're going to create an entirely new series that goes into more in-depth things with React. Okay, so I will see you guys in my next in the next section of this section of this tutorial. Alright guys, so we are back in our final section of our React.js tutorial, and we're going to close it off by learning the useEffect hook. So we're going to talk about what it is, what it's useful for, and how it actually works. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys an example. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's just say hypothetically, let's say you want to build an app, and your application, one of the pages, when the user first loads up the page, right, when they first visited it, they need to see some kind of content. Well, let's say they are trying to access, someone's blog, and that blog should display a bunch of different posts, right? It should display, let's say 10 posts, right? How would we accomplish that? Well, the first thing that you might think about is, okay, well, can't I just create, a component, fetch the API by creating, a function wrapping around fetch? Well, let's actually try that, and let's actually see what happens. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and go inside the root, and I'm going to go ahead and use an else if, and well, just like I said, this is just a cheap way of doing some routing. I would not recommend it. Just use React router DOM. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blog.jsx component, and we're just going to return this blog component right over here. Okay, so let's just do that. So blog, just like that. Okay, so let's just do a simple h1 blog. Now if I go over here, if I go to the blog URL, I should see it over there. Okay, so now let's say I want to fetch some posts, right? So how would we do that? Well, like I said, we've used fetch before, or maybe you may have not, but you may have called some kind of API at some point, right? And you want to basically call the API, you want to get the data, and you want to render it in the DOM. So let's go back to the original method that we were thinking about doing. So let's go ahead and say const fetch blogs, or I should say fetch posts. Okay, fetch posts. And this is just going to be a function, and we're going to use the fetch API. You can use any API you want. You can use Axios if you want, but I'm just going to use fetch. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, let's call fetch, and let's go ahead and pass in our URL. So I have a mock server. I'm using Mockhoon. It's a program that allows you to mock an API server. So you can use it for development. It's really cool. So the URL is going to be API/blogs/posts. So localhost port 4001 /API/blog/posts. And then it's going to return a promise, and we need to actually resolve the promise by calling .then. And this is actually going to return the response object. So we actually have to get the actual JSON content. We need to call res.json, which also returns a promise. So we need to do a simple promise chain. So it's going to be 2 thens, and then we're going to have a then we're going to actually get the data. Okay, and if there's any error, we should call .catch at the very end to resolve, or not resolve, to handle any rejection from the promise. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just call fetch post. So this is what we can do, right? We can just simply create a function and call it. So let's see what happens. So you can see that, yes, it's actually making the API call. You can see that right over here, that it's calling the API and it's returning an array. If I were to, I'm going to go ahead and let me go back into this program. And let me go ahead and just add some fake data. So let's just say ID 1 and then title React.js tutorial, and then I'm just gonna leave it at that. You could, like I said, you can mock this however you like, but I'm just gonna make it short and simple. Okay, so ID2, ID3, let's just say Angular tutorial, and then let's do Express.js tutorial. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh, and you can see that we have our data. That's fine. Okay, and now there's a problem that it is calling it twice. So now, but that itself isn't the main issue right now. Okay, now the main issue is, how do I actually display this in the DOM? Right. Well, there's no way that I can actually display this in the DOM right over from just this implementation, because, well, the variable is over here, and how do I get this variable accessible outside of this fetch posts? Right. Well, you might think, okay, well, can't we just we just learned about useState? Can't we just create a state variable called blogs, and then have the setter update the value of the blog state? So let's try that. Let's see what happens. So, and that's some good curiosity. So let's do const, and let's create the blogs variable, and let's do set blogs. Or I should really say posts. Really, I should really say posts. Okay, and let's call useState, and this is going to have an initial state of an array. Okay, we want to try to avoid using undefined values as much as we can, or null, or like null values. Arrays are fine, but undefined, I would recommend trying your best to avoid it. But unless if you were to handle the unless if you to actually check to see if it was undefined, that would be okay too. Okay. So anyway, so we have an empty array. We have posts. So now we need to update the state of posts. So the best place to actually do that would be inside this callback, inside the second .thens callback. So let's go ahead and call that let's call it set posts, pass in data, and let's see what happens. So you can see that right now, what is going on? It seems like it's calling the API an infinite amount of times, and you can actually see that happening because, it's logging data over and over again. Okay, so let me explain what's happening. So what's happening is that, and it's actually really important that you guys understand why this is happening. If you guys don't understand why this is happening, you're gonna have a hard time understanding state and calling APIs. Okay, so remember how I mentioned earlier when we were talking about state, whenever you update a state variable, whenever the value of a state variable changes, the component is going to re-render. Okay, now what's happening here is that whenever we visit this blog page, this component, whenever this component is rendered, it's going to immediately call fetch posts. Okay, now what happens here is when fetch posts is called, when the promise resolves, okay, it's going to update the state posts. It's going to update the value of that state, and when that value is updated, it's going to re-render the component, and when the component re-renders, it's going to call fetch posts again. And then when fetch post is called, it's going to call the API. It's going to resolve the promise. Okay, it's going to update the state, and then it's going to, and when the state gets updated, then what happens? The entire component is going to get re-rendered. Okay, the component, the blog component, not the entire DOM, just the component itself. Okay, so how do we actually fix this? Well, I think let's conclude what actually is going on. So in conclusion, we actually cannot fetch an API when the DOM is loading like this, or when the component is loading like this. We cannot do that, okay? And this is where the useEffect hook comes in hand. Okay, so before we actually, let's not delete this function. This function's still going to be useful, okay? But let's actually import the useEffect hook. Okay, you can import that. It's from the React package, and the useEffect hook is going to take in a callback function. Okay, now inside this function, this is where you'd want to perform your effect. That's why it's called useEffect. useEffect is good for performing side effects including things like fetching an API, updating state, side effects, right? You can call APIs, you can do literally any type of side effect that you can think about, okay? Now inside the function, inside this useEffect function, this is where you want to perform your effect. So that's why it's called useEffect, right? useEffect, you want to perform your effect. And what exactly are we talking about when we say effect? Well, basically side effects. So for example, if you want to make an API call, right, that's an example of a side effect. If you want to, like anything that is just like, a side effect, it would go inside this useEffect hook. Okay? So what we want to do inside the useEffect hook is we basically want to make an API call. Okay? Now, after that API call, we actually want to update the state. So we're going to call set posts. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead. You can actually keep this function if you want, and you can actually just call fetch posts like this. Right? And you can also use fetch itself over there. So let's see if that will fix our issue. And you're going to see that it's still looping infinitely. Right? It's pretty much like an infinite loop. So right now, the main problem that's happening is you need to understand like how the useEffect is called. Okay, so by default, useEffect is always going to be called upon every single render. Okay, so remember what we said, after every render, like when we first render the component, it's going to call useEffect. It's going to call this callback function that's inside useEffect. Okay, when that callback function is called, so it's going to invoke this fetch posts, it's going to update the state. Because the state is being updated, that's going to cause a re-render, and that re-render is going to cause the callback function of useEffect to be invoked. And like I said, we're going to be back in the same infinite loop again. So we're not wrong for using useEffect to invoke the API, but in order to actually fix this issue of infinite looping, we need to actually pass in a second parameter called the dependency array, or you can call it dependency list, whatever you want to call it, or you can just say dependencies. But it's just an array of dependencies that this useEffect is going to depend on, and based on it depending on whatever dependencies that we want, it's going to invoke the useEffect function. So for example, if you leave an empty dependency array for useEffect, it's only going to call the function, this callback function, like one time, like after the first render. Okay, so even though we are making a state update, it will not call useEffect again. Okay, so useEffect is going to call this fetch posts. We're going to update set posts, and even though that the component re-rendered, right? Even though the component re-rendered, the useEffect will know that it's not going to call this function again because we have an empty dependency list or dependency array. Now, if you wanted useEffect to call after every single time a certain state variable was updated, right? Let's say for example, if I were to actually, so this is just going to be a bad example, but if I were to pass posts, you're going to see we're going to get that infinite loop again. But the reason why I'm showing you this example is because whenever you pass in a state variable, whenever that state variable is changed, it's going to call this function again. Okay, so to make things simple, right? If you don't have the dependency list, or if you have the dependency list that has the state variable in there, you're gonna have an infinite loop every single time, especially if you're calling, if you're performing a side effect that updates that state itself. Okay, so if you don't want it to infinite loop, just leave it empty. But let's say hypothetically we wanted to actually fetch posts again. Let's say for example something may have happened, right? Maybe we may have received a WebSocket event indicating that we should update posts, right? Let's say we have, let's say const, do fetch, set do fetch. Let's just do fetch, or fetch posts is fetching. Or wait, what should I call this? Fetch posts, set fetch posts. Okay, yeah, this is fine. So let's say this is going to be some kind of, this is a Boolean value. Okay, and this, oh wait, actually, let's call this, fetch new posts. Okay, there we go. Set fetch new posts, right? So let's say, for example, this is going to be a state variable that's going to control whether or not we should fetch new posts, right? So right now, if I were to put this variable inside the dependency list, you're going to see that, like I said, nothing's going to happen, right? Nothing's going to happen, okay? Because, like I said, the value of fetch new posts is not being altered, okay? We're not changing it, so that way it's not going to actually call this useEffect function. But let's say if I create a button, let's call it fetch posts, right? It's just an example. So now watch this. So let's say, for example, I only want to fetch posts whenever the value of fetch new posts is altered. So whenever this button is clicked, we're gonna go ahead and simply do a simple update on fetch new posts. So we're gonna call set fetch new post, and we're gonna call this to true. Okay. And let's go ahead and refresh. So if I click fetch posts, you're gonna see that fetch posts was changed. If I click it again, you're gonna see that nothing happens because the value of fetch posts is not being changed. Okay. Now I can actually simply keep on changing this over and over again. Like I can do this. So I can say if fetch new posts is true, set it to false, otherwise set it to true. Okay. And so every single time I click on this fetch post, it's going to keep on fetching the API, right? So let's walk through this again. So when I first load up the page, the useEffect hook is going to run once. Okay, it's going to run once in this scenario because we have a dependency list that depends on fetch new posts, right? And since fetch new post was not modified, it's not going to call. It is not going to call the fetch posts function again. It's not going to call this callback function. Okay, but if we click on this button, the value of set fetch new posts, or the value of fetch new posts, is altered. It goes from false to true, and then true to false, and then false to true. Okay, and when that value is changed, the useEffect hook is going to invoke the callback function again. Okay, and then if we keep on clicking this button, it's going to keep changing the value of fetch new posts, and it's going to keep on fetching posts for us. Okay, so that's pretty much how this useEffect hook works. Now let's say, for example, if we wanted to mess up this useEffect hook, the way you could do that is, let's say, for example, if you were to update the value of fetch new posts inside this fetch posts, yeah, that would actually mess it up. You would get the infinite loop again. So you got to be very careful. So the reason why I am going out of my way to show you guys these different errors and scenarios is because I want you guys to understand how useEffect works and why exactly you run into an infinite loop. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. But just remember that the useEffect hook is always going to be called after every single render if there's no dependency array. If you add an empty dependency array, it should be fine. It'll only call it once, okay, after every render. But if you add values in the dependency array, you have to be careful with which one you add, right? You don't want to add posts, because if you add posts, well, it's literally saying, okay, well, this post's value is being changed, so we're just going to go ahead and keep invoking this callback function over and over again, okay? Because we're calling fetch posts. Fetch posts is updating the posts state, okay? And since the posts variable is on this dependency array, call useEffect callback function again. Okay, so you just got to be very careful. I hope this example was good enough, and I really hope this section of the React.js tutorial for useEffect has really helped you guys out a lot. And so that's going to be pretty much it for React useEffect. Anyways, so that is going to be pretty much it for this tutorial. We've covered a lot of stuff in this video, in this series. Like, I'm actually looking at the whole I'm looking at the total time. Like, it's been 2 hours and 23 minutes. Like, I don't even know if I'll even upload everything all at once or split it up into 2 parts. I think I'll just upload everything at once. But anyways, if you guys have watched through this whole thing, if you guys have finished this whole tutorial, be proud of yourself, because React is not easy for everyone. Some people find it easy, some people find it hard, and everyone's different. And the only way that you're going to achieve this goal of learning React and understanding React and being able to use React to build projects and build applications is by practicing. So what am I trying to get at? Well, what I'm trying to say is that watching videos on YouTube or taking Udemy courses or just like reading a bunch of Reddit posts, they're not gonna make you a professional developer overnight. Even my videos myself, even myself for videos, right? Like even my videos, I'm not claiming that my videos will make you a professional developer. The point of these videos is to provide guidance for you so that you can actually walk yourself through the video itself with an instructor and then actually practice on your own. So what I suggest for you guys is, if you guys are confident, try to take all the concepts that you just learned and try to reiterate again, try to go over it again, try to build something simple. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can just build a simple application, like a simple form, right? Just practice all the concepts. And then as you practice, make sure you're challenging yourself, because if you never challenge yourself, you are never going to improve, okay? The only way that you're going to get better at React or just programming in general is by challenging yourself and questioning yourself and always doing your own due diligence and researching, so that way you can become a better developer. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys like I said, if you guys watch through this whole video, give yourself, give yourself give yourself some credit, because a lot of people, can't really like focus on one video. So if you're able to do so, congratulations. I would suggest you guys to check out my other videos. I have like a ton of other videos where I do React stuff, so you can go ahead and watch those. And yeah, like I said, if you guys like the video, feel free to subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you guys would like to join the channel as a member, you guys can do so as well. There's a little button down there. And if you guys want to get in contact with me, I have a Discord server. The Discord server is linked down below. I would love to chat with you guys and be closer with my community. And if you guys have any questions regarding coding or career advice, you can always join the Discord server and just chat with us. There's a lot of people on there. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in my next one. Peace out.